Mr. Bean was going on holiday. He was very excited. He packed his suitcase meticulously, making sure he had everything he thought he might need for his grand adventure. He'd been planning this trip for weeks, and the day had finally arrived. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and Mr. Bean could hardly contain his excitement. He had a checklist, and he was determined to follow it to the letter. He started with the essentials. In it went a toothbrush, a single sock, and a rubber duck. These were not just random items. Each had a special place in Mr. Bean's heart. The toothbrush was for his impeccable dental hygiene, the sock was a lucky charm, and the rubber duck was his bath time companion. He smiled as he placed each item carefully in the suitcase, making sure they were snug and secure. Of course, Teddy had to come too. Teddy was more than just a stuffed animal. He was Mr. Bean's best friend and confidant. They had been through countless adventures together, and this trip would be no different. Mr. Bean gently placed Teddy on top of the other items, giving him a little pat for good luck. Mr. Bean zipped up his suitcase. It was a bit of a struggle as he had packed it to the brim, but with a little effort and a lot of determination he managed to get it closed. He stood back and admired his work, feeling a sense of accomplishment. Everything was in its place, and he was ready to go. He was ready for an adventure. The world was his oyster, and he couldn't wait to explore it. He imagined all the places he would visit, the people he would meet, and the memories he would make. This was going to be a trip to remember, and he was ready for whatever came his way. Mr. Bean put on his hat. It was his favourite hat, one that he wore on all his adventures. It was a bit worn and tattered, but it had character, just like him. He adjusted it to make sure it was just right, giving himself a nod of approval in the mirror. He looked at himself in the mirror. He wanted to make sure he looked his best for the journey ahead. He straightened his tie, smoothed out his jacket and gave himself a big smile. He was ready to take on the world. He made a silly face. He giggled. It was important to start the day with a bit of fun after all. Laughter was the best way to set the tone for a great day, and Mr. Bean was determined to have the best day ever. Today was going to be a good day. He could feel it in his bones. Everything was falling into place, and he was ready to embrace whatever came his way. The world was full of possibilities, and he was eager to explore them all. He picked up his suitcase, and Teddy, they were a team, ready to face the world together. With a deep breath and a final look around, Mr. Bean felt a surge of excitement. This was it. The adventure was about to begin. He walked out the door. The world was waiting, and Mr. Bean was ready to meet it head-on. With a spring in his step and a smile on his face, he set off on his journey, ready for whatever adventures lay ahead. Mr. Bean arrived at the train station. He needed a ticket. The station was bustling with people, each in a hurry to catch their trains. Mr. Bean, however, seemed to be in his usual days, taking in the surroundings with a mix of curiosity and confusion. He found a ticket machine. It looked very complicated. The machine had numerous buttons, each labelled with tiny text that was hard to read. Mr. Bean squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of the instructions. The more he looked, the more perplexed he became. Mr. Bean scratched his head. He wasn't sure which button to press first. The machine seemed to be mocking him with its complexity. He glanced around, hoping to find someone who could help, but everyone seemed too busy with their own tasks. He put his coin in the machine. Nothing happened. Mr. Bean frowned and tried inserting the coin again, this time with a bit more force. Still, the machine remained unresponsive. He could feel the frustration building up inside him. He pushed the buttons randomly, still nothing. Mr. Bean looked around. He noticed a few people glancing his way, probably wondering why he was struggling so much with a simple ticket machine. He felt a bit embarrassed, but was determined to get his ticket. Everyone was staring at him. He felt embarrassed. The pressure of the onlookers made him even more anxious. He could feel his face turning red as he fumbled with the machine. He wished he could just disappear. He took a deep breath. Mr. Bean knew he had to calm down if he wanted to figure this out. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. When he opened them, he felt a bit more composed and ready to tackle the machine again. He gave the machine a little kick. It was a gentle nudge, more out of frustration than aggression. To his surprise, the machine made a noise as if it was coming back to life. Mr. Bean's eyes widened with hope. Suddenly a ticket popped out. Mr. Bean smiled. It was a moment of triumph. He quickly grabbed the ticket, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The ordeal was finally over. He grabbed the ticket and ran towards his platform. With the ticket in hand, Mr. Bean felt a surge of energy. He dashed through the station, weaving through the crowd, determined not to miss his train. The adventure was just beginning. Mr. Bean reached the platform just as the train arrived. People were rushing to get on. Mr. Bean saw an empty seat. He pushed his way through the crowd. He tripped over someone's luggage. He fell, landing right on his suitcase. He quickly got up, dusted himself off, and smiled sheepishly at the other passengers. He squeezed past them and finally reached his seat. He collapsed onto it, exhausted but triumphant. He had made it. Mr. Bean settled into his seat. It was a beautiful day and he decided to spend some time in the park. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and everything seemed perfect. He had his favourite book with him and was looking forward to a peaceful afternoon. As he got comfortable, he noticed a suitcase next to him. It was a rather peculiar sight, because he didn't remember seeing it when he first sat down. The suitcase was old-fashioned, with leather straps and a few travel stickers from various countries. Curiosity got the better of him. He leaned over and examined the suitcase closely. To his surprise, it looked exactly like his own suitcase. He quickly checked the tag, hoping to find his name on it, but it wasn't his name. He looked around, puzzled. Just then, he noticed a man in a shiny waistcoat frantically looking around. The man seemed to be searching for something important. His eyes darted from one bench to another, and he looked increasingly worried. Mr. Bean put two and two together. The man in the shiny waistcoat must be the owner of the suitcase. He looked relieved when he spotted Mr. Bean with the suitcase. Mr. Bean decided to be helpful. He stood up, picked up the suitcase and started walking towards the man. He could see the man's face light up with hope as he approached. When he reached the man, he gently tapped him on the shoulder. The man turned around, his eyes wide with anticipation. Mr. Bean pointed at the suitcase and smiled. The man looked at the suitcase, then back at Mr. Bean, and a huge smile spread across his face. The man smiled and thanked Mr. Bean profusely. He was clearly relieved and grateful to have found his lost suitcase. He took the suitcase and went to his seat, still smiling. Mr. Bean watched him go, feeling a sense of satisfaction. It was a small act of kindness, but it made a big difference to the man in the shiny waistcoat. Mr. Bean returned to his bench, ready to enjoy his book once more. Section 5. On Board Antics. Mr. Bean was bored. He opened the suitcase. He wanted to play with Teddy. He pulled out a fluffy white rabbit instead. Mr. Bean was surprised. Where was Teddy? He dug deeper into the suitcase. He pulled out colourful scarves, a magic wand and a top hat. He put on the hat. It was too big. It fell over his eyes. He giggled. This suitcase was full of surprises. Section 6. Smoke and Shenanigans. Mr. Bean found a small ball wrapped in paper. He unwrapped it. It looked interesting. He threw it up in the air. Suddenly the ball exploded. Thick coloured smoke filled the train carriage. People started coughing. They couldn't see. Mr. Bean thought it was hilarious. He laughed and clapped his hands. He blew on the smoke, making funny shapes with his mouth. Section 7. The Magician's Pursuit. The man in the shiny waistcoat smelled smoke. He rushed over. He couldn't believe his eyes. His magic smoke bomb. He looked at Mr. Bean. Mr. Bean was holding a wand, covered in soot and wearing the magician's hat. The magician marched over to Mr. Bean. He had to get his suitcase back. That was his magic act ruined. He tapped Mr. Bean on the shoulder. Section 8. A Case of Mistaken Identity. "Excuse me," the magician said, "that's my suitcase?" Mr. Bean looked up. He saw the man's angry face. He didn't understand. He pointed at the suitcase and then at himself. "Mine?" he asked, confused. The magician sighed. He swapped the suitcases. He pointed to the one with Teddy peeking out. "Yours," he said. Mr. Bean smiled and nodded happily. He patted Teddy on the head. Section 9. Bean's Grand Finale. The magician grabbed his own suitcase and hurried away. He had a show to save. Mr. Bean watched him go. He shrugged. He didn't understand what all the fuss was about. He still had a wand. He waved it around, pretending to be a conductor. Mr. Bean smiled. This was turning out to be a very interesting holiday indeed. He settled back in his seat, Teddy tucked under his arm, and prepared for more unexpected adventures.